This is Shirley Collier at Lawton, Oklahoma, April the 3rd, 1980, interviewing Lieutenant Colonel Robert D. Offer for Living Legends, and that is spelled ROBERTDOFFER. Now, can you tell us when you came to Oklahoma?
Well, I came to Oklahoma the first time in the fall of 1940 for a short 3-month motors course. Lived in town and then went back at the end of the course, went back to, I think we were stationed in Fort Sheridan, Illinois at the time.
How old were you at that time?
25.
And
That was fall of 1940. And the school building we went to was right across the street. It was right across the street from where Summerall Hall is now, and it's since burned down. It's gone. There's nothing left there but a slab. Tiny Jark was the commandant of the school at the time, as big then as he was, as he is now.
And you spent 30 years in the service?
That I did.
And you are in the, you were in the artillery?
Mm-hmm. Matter of fact, I'm the middle generation of 3 generations of artillerymen. My father ahead of me, my son after me.
Did you just have the one?
We got 3 children.
3?
2 girls. The youngest one is also married to an artilleryman, and the oldest girl is married in the Air Force.
Were you here during the war, or did you leave?
I left this country on the 29th day of May 1942 and didn't get back until the latter part of June in 45. So what happened at Fort Sill during the war years, I have no idea.
Let's see, you came back what year now, 1945?
Mm-hmm. From Europe, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I came back on a litter.
And you are retired now?
Mm-hmm.
What year did you retire?
I retired in 1968 in Austin, Texas. That was my last tour of duty down there as Deputy Commander of 8th Corps, and later on as Acting Commander of the 8th Corps.
Can you tell us some of your experiences here on the base before you left the base during the war?
I wasn't here during the war. I was not here during the war.
Oh, I see. That's when you went.
I went in April of 1942. I lit out for Iceland. From there I went to Ireland. From Ireland I went to North Africa. From North Africa I went to Italy. And from Italy I came back. Went in the hospital in Virginia, Staunton, Virginia. And nobody would believe it. I had undulant fever. Undulant fever. Nobody would. I'd swear up and down that I didn't eat anything on the market. Boy, I sure had it. The doctor said, that's impossible. I say, well, you might say so in your medical literature, but you say I've got undulant fever, and I tell you I did not eat any local Italian food. I say, oh, it's impossible. Don't ever get undulant fever.
What is it? What?
Undulant fever. It's also called brucellosis, or Malta fever, or goat fever. And that, it does just that, it undulates. Every afternoon about 4 o'clock, my temperature hit 104 degrees. And your big joints, knees, shoulders, ache. God, ache like somebody's been hitting me with a rubber hammer.
How long did it take you before you were...
Oh, I finally got out of the hospital in November 45, about 6 months. I started no specific treatment for it, just a high-protein diet, try to put a little weight back on me, vitamins. The doc said he was originally considered, I think, oromycin, but it was very short supply then. It was just coming on the market, short supply. He said, I got people in here that need it more than you do, so you aren't going to get it. Suits me, doc.
Did they ever decide how you got it?
Yes, I think I know. One day as we were moving up the Italian boot, we had our CP in an Italian farm. And they had some beautiful cattle there. How they'd escaped getting shot up, I don't know. Maybe they'd taken them away somehow and brought them back. And I put my hands on them. Well, later on that day, in that farmyard, we had lunch out in the open. It may well be that I didn't wash good enough or whatever. And that was probably the way it came. Because that was in the fall of oh no, midsummer of 44. And I began getting the symptoms. I can't remember exactly when it was.
The catalog you carried it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you came back when the war was over, not
Mhm.
because of your
No.
of the fever that you.
Well, I was evacuated as a hospital patient. That in itself is a long story, but it's a... Found out by happenstance what I had. The doc thought I had malaria. Took a blood sample, sent it back, came back, and he said that nothing wrong with me, and gave it to me, a little lab report. And I stuck it in my wallet. And a few days later, no, it must have been 6 weeks later, I had a impacted tooth. My jaw was swollen up so much I could barely open it. So went down to the hospital. The doctor broke me in so he could treat this infection. And in the course of the thing, the doctor, chief of medical service, came in and started talking to me, and I mentioned this series of fever and whatnot, and told him about the blood sample. I said, as a matter of fact, I got it. My pants were hanging up on the wall above me. So I reached up there and pulled my wallet out and gave him a little slip of paper. And he wouldn't look at it. I'll be back shortly. In came a lab technician, took a blood sample. Doc came back about 20 minutes later and said, you've got uneven fever. And this first doctor didn't even recognize it. Didn't even see it. So when I started the evacuation route back to the States, in that course of that evacuation, I traveled by every means known in the medical corps to get someplace. Your own battalion ambulance, an airplane, a train, and a hospital ship. Not necessarily in that order. But that was the way it went.
Would you tell us when you were born and where and?
I was born in Salt Lake City, April 15th, 1915. My mother's parents were Mormons, and my father's family had moved into Nebraska from sometime from Germany, I don't know when. But he later on, they gravitated up to Idaho, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And he'd come down to Salt Lake City to go to school. He and mother were married there. And then he went back in the Army. He served during World War I and got out for a while, then went back in again.
Did you tell us your father's name? I don't remember.
No, he didn't. His name was Irving D.
And your mother's name?
Betty. She never had a middle name.
Did you have any brothers and sisters?
Nope.
You were the only child.
Only child. I must have been a brat.
Your mother was a Mormon, but your father wasn't. I mean, is that right? Your brother's background was maybe
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, not necessarily. Might make some comment about contribution here at Fort Sill. From the summer of 64 until the summer of 60 to 64, I was G4. At that time, the museum fell under the aegis of the G4, not the G3 as it is now. So that's when I got to know Gillette Griswold and became involved in some of the museum projects in the artillery half section. And, that was a lot of fun.
How many tours did you have to Fort Sill?
One on a 4-year tour at G4 from 60 to 64, and then that 3-month session back in 40. And came up here from Texas A&M sometime in 55 for about a 5-day charm school. Put on by the school over in the area near where that water tower is in the missile area, over in that vicinity. One of the things we were able to accomplish here was when I first came here, each one of the technical services that's the ordnance, the engineer, signal corps, those people, had their own field maintenance shop and their own supply point. So that means that a unit supply sergeant starting out sometime to collect what he needed for the battery, or the battalion, would have to make a big circuit of 7 different places. And same for the field maintenance, scattered all over the post. So Rex Beale and I, who's still here in the G4 shop, we got our heads together and said, well, look, why don't we put all those supply people in one place? So the guy goes to a department store and gets what he wants, instead of going to specialty shops like you do in Europe. Well, tech service is screaming and hollered and yelled because in year 1 they've been doing their own business, their own way, separately. But I told him, I said, look, you don't have a choice. This is a fait accompli. Move, now. Well, that was step number 1. Then the next step was to break down all these separate tech service accounts, squeeze them into one great big supply account. Well, that caused even more anguish and despair. But he finally said, okay, no question, you were not asking you, just do it. Well, those were the 2 initial steps that eventually led to Fort Sill now having one of the most advanced computerized supply systems going. In fact, many people have come out here, so I've been told, in recent years, to see how the system works and who does what to who. So that was, I guess that was my contribution to Fort Sill during 4 years here. And perhaps one of the most scariest events was the new chief nurse was making a trip around the Army, and her name was, wish I could remember. General Griffin had a reception for her in the old polo club. About halfway into this thing, or about half an hour after the reception line stopped, this gal grabbed me and pushed me over in the corner, and for 30 minutes, she just gave me unshirted hell about the way the nurses here on this post had to live, and where they lived. And finally, I think Bob Neal, engineer, put her up to it, because he was running the quarters at that time. But boy, that was the first of the ERA. Brother, and she let me have it. And finally I said, well, what do you want? She said, I want the nurses to be able to select any set of quarters, any BOQ, that their grade and time and grade would otherwise authorize them to. I said, you mean just a complete mix of men, women, and everybody? Certainly. I said, well, how about some knucklehead walking down the hall in his drawers? Chief nurse says, how's that going to bother her? I said, okay. So the next day, Bob Neal and I got together and wrote out a recommendation. Took it into General Griffin. He looked at it, slowly looked up at me, said, Bob, you must be crazy. I said, no, sir, never more serious in my life. Griffin looked at Neal. Yes, sir. Next darn thing you knew, the chief of the hospital was in there, the chief nurse was in there. And they both agreed. Reluctantly, Griffin signed the darn thing. And the next day, Bob Neal and I went into the old man, and you know that Comanche house right there in the cross point? That used to be the nurses' quarters. So we went in, General Griffin said, give this the building fund, let them make a visiting officer quarters out of it.
And that's where the nurses lived when she was complaining. Was it not as nice a building as it is now? Has it been renovated?
Not renovated particularly, but it meant each nurse was living in a small room, probably with a connecting bath sharing the other one. And some of the more senior nurses, maybe the chief nurse, had a little sitting room. You know, on Sheridan Road, right where Burl Road crosses Sheridan Road, on the way to the high-rise apartments,
Okay.
sitting up there on the hill, that was originally designed as the nurses' quarters for the new hospital. And when the nurses started living any place, Bob Neal said, well, what good will a BOQ way down there do us? Let's get it up here and get it with the rest of the BOQs where they can walk to most of their classes, and the mess hall is right down the foot of the hill there. So that's how come that happens to be there. And I gather now that the nurses live in any place they want to. That's why. I wish I could remember the gal's name. She later on wound up, I think, with a Major General Officer.
I guess those things like she got what she wanted, pretty much.
Well, she's got a point. One of the problems is that many times, late at night, a nurse with a certain specialty, a surgical specialty of some kind or another, she'll be called to report to the hospital post-haste. Now, if she's got to come from some god-off place way out here in the post, she's by herself at night. And that's as opposed to living right next to the hospital, because they can always have some corpsman whip across the street and escort her back. But the solution to that problem here is if there is a nurse that's isolated or something like that, all she's got to do is just call the EMTs. And they'll come up there, check the car out for her, and follow her to the hospital. So that's really poses no great problem. And that was one of the arguments I gave this gal. And, she shot that down in a hurry.
How many acres are on this post?
Fort Sill consists of 96,000 plus acres. And by the time we used to be able to use some 30,000 in the wildlife refuge, that gave Fort Sill an effective acreage of about 126,000. It's by no means the largest in the world, in the States. Bliss has got several million acres, that big missile range out there. But it's adequate for our purposes. It varies from, north to south. It varies from about 3 to 11 miles. And east to west, as I recall, it's about 20-odd miles. And it's divided primarily into 4 basic areas. There's the East Range, and the Garrison area, which is this right here, the West Range, and the Post Oak Range, which is beyond the road that goes from, what's that little town? Cache up to the wildlife refuge. That's Post Oak over on the other side. And that was required about 1959, or early 60s, I recall, and it caused a hell of a furor around here. Darner got the post commander fired, but he survived that, and later on got his 3rd star and went to Hawaii. He died recently. That was Bertie Barnes.
What are some of your main interests now since you're retired?
Oh, playing a little bit of golf. And for a while I was doing a little bit of flying, but I haven't flown in a long time.
You must have liked Fort Sill quite a lot to retire here, but which was your least favorite time, would you say, other than the war?
I'd say it was up toward Custer, Michigan, just while the war was brewing. Not all of the time, part of the time.
Can you tell us something about your duties there?
Yeah, for a while I was a motor officer in the service battery of the 50th Field Artillery Battalion, and the battalion commander hated my guts. And he eventually came up with an idea and shipped me off to the 21st Field Artillery. And I became supply officer down there and motor officer. And in the 21st Field Artillery, it was a delightful situation. Real good people, bunch of competent guys, and the job I had was nothing more fun than anything else I've ever done, because during that period of time we made 2 or 3 maneuvers in Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And we just hooked everything up, loaded up the trucks, and started on the road. And vehicles would break down. But every morning during those maneuvers, every single morning, every vehicle moved in its own power. We got them repaired overnight if necessary. And the motor sergeant, I can see his face right now, he's playing it today, but I cannot remember his name. An old trooper out of the 1st Cavalry Division. A remarkable man. Remarkable man. He had that thing organized. He commanded that thing.
How large a group was that?
Me, Zakushi the driver, first sergeant, supply sergeant, and 6 or 7 mechanics, 10 people. We got a Jeep, 2.5-ton truck, and a wrecker. 2 2.5-ton trucks and a wrecker. Then fixed up as a part shop. Every night, driver and I'd lot out for some little town like Bean Blossom, Indiana. And there is a town by that name. There is. And go to a filling station and ask the guy, said, who owns the parts store? Where can I find him? He said, well, that's the guy who's Joe Jones. Here's his phone number. So I'd call him up and tell him who I was and say, come on down to the shop, please, and sell me so-and-so. And 9 times out of 10, they always showed up. We get the parts and start on back. And one night, Sergeant Oswald, O-S-C-H-W-A-L-D, Sergeant Oswald, Emil C. For some reason or other, he normally stayed behind, but this night he went with us. And on the way back to the camp, the bivouac, real long, straight road, about 1.5 miles down there, you could see the light of a tavern. And the supply sergeant, I forgot his name, he was driving, and Oswald and I were sitting in the back of the old command car. And finally, Oswald turns and said, Lieutenant, you think we can stop down there and have a beer? And I said, Oswald, I think it's a real fine idea. We got time, haven't we? He said, oh, yes, sir. And we pulled in. Oswald buys a beer for the three of us. And about ready to leave, I said, you still got time? Let me buy a refill? Thank you, that'll be fine. Then later on, we hop in the Jeep or the station wagon, the command car, and go on home. Start out the next morning, as usual. But that was a very pleasant, fulfilling thing because you were getting something done. And I don't think other outfits might have had the same success, but I do know this, that golly, every morning, everything was back on the road running again.
Having had, did you say you had 3 daughters at the time?
Son and 2 daughters.
Son and 2 daughters. What would you say was I could see the advantages of the military life for children, living around and so forth, and the knowledge that they gained, but what would you say was the greatest disadvantage for your children? Or did they see any?
I don't think they did. No, I don't think so.
Was your wife and children here at that time?
Yeah. The only time we were separated was for the 3 years during World War II and the year in Korea from 64, 65. But I was able to make 2 trips back during that period of time because my father died during it then and came back. No, really.
Well, I know we wonder sometimes when we have to pull them out of school, in case they go to school, they leave their friends behind, and we wonder if that's affecting them adversely, and some of ours are not through school yet, and you can't tell quite. So I'm wondering if in the end, if you can tell.
No, I honestly don't think so. It didn't affect me as far as I can tell, because as a little kid, we went to the Philippines, and Mother and I came back for some reason or other for a while, and we went back to the Philippines. And then on the way home, we went up, spent, a month, 6 weeks in China, 2 weeks in Shanghai, and then on the train up to Peking for a month. And then on home, and through the Panama Canal to Ohio, and from Ohio to Bliss, and Bliss to Minneapolis. And from Minneapolis, I went to Westpoint. And then from there, when I graduated, no. Betsy was a babe in arms when we went to Rome in 1950. And she grew up speaking Italian only. And until we'd been back in the States for about, I'd say 6 weeks at the minimum. If you wanted to communicate with her, you spoke Italian to her.
How old was she when you
3.
returned to the States?
3. And Jane, her older sister, she was born in 46, Betsy was 54 years difference. Jane went to Italian school for a while, run by the Suarez, the nuns. And she grew up bilingual. In fact, as a little kid, 7 years old, she could pick up an American newspaper and read it. Now, she might pronounce the word same, as the Italians would pronounce it, but she was reading phonetically. And she was doing her homework in pen and ink, in a workbook.
I guess the facilities at that time were not quite so good as they are for the Americans.
We lived on the economy.
You did.
Mm-hmm. Initially, the embassy had a little tiny commissary, and then later on, we were able to go up to Leghorn, Livorno, to the Army commissary up there, go up about once every 2 weeks, and just fill up the back, the car, and drive on back down, because it was about about 175-mile trip. But living on the economy wasn't too bad. Every now and then the lights would go out, or somebody would screw up and shut your telephone off. You couldn't call out. The incoming call would come in. And when that happens, you stick the maid on them. You go over and scream and rant and rave at them. We had a fairly decent apartment. Wasn't too expensive. We got a pretty decent station allowance. And food in the Italian market, cheap and good. And we were able to hire 2 maids, both Sardinian, live in full-time. And after a while, we insisted that one of them stay there Sunday afternoon, but later on, we told them both of them take off. And they generally leave spaghetti or something like that for us to cook Sunday night. But oftentimes Sunday afternoon, you hop in the car and drive up to Ostia or go other someplace, go down to the casino or Anzio or someplace like that.
How long were you in Rome?
3 years. Believe it or not, we stayed in the same apartment for 3 years, and everybody else in the darn mag was jumping around every year.
What was your job there?
It was my job primarily to put together the program of military aid for the Italian Army that was being given under the Foreign Military Assistance Act. Each year was about the first year I think it was about 225 million. The second year it was about another 230, 40 million. And the last year, and I'm very proud of this, I went to the Italian G4 all by myself. And between us, in Italian, we hammered out a $250 million program.
That must have been an exciting time to be there and be involved in the reconstruction, so to speak.
Well, there was another thing about it that was personally very satisfying to me, is that the Italian, one of them, Aldo Di Marco to start out with, and later on Alfonso Checchia, trusted me enough to tell me what I needed to know. And the basis was that we would provide equipment as the Italian Army activated units. If the unit didn't exist, no equipment. If it in fact existed, okay, program the equipment. On many occasions I've had Checchia, a couple of times, Di Marco say, look, this unit is not going to be activated this year as we scheduled. Take that money and put it someplace else. And I'd say, okay, because we always had unfilled demand for the units that we were equipping. So it would be a simple matter to reprogram that. And that put me in good stead because we always had to go to either to, for a while, London, and later for a while, Paris, and later on to Frankfurt, to justify your program and explain it to some of the hotshots from Washington, D.C. to come out there in the JMAG headquarters that was in Frankfurt eventually, and justify it to them. And I never had any trouble. I never had any trouble. Because if somebody started giving me a bad time, I had sufficient data from Checchia or Di Marco, whoever it was, just refute every argument. So I could go up to Frankfurt in 20 minutes, be free to go. Same thing up in Paris and London.
Did you say your son had the Army career?
Mm-hmm. He graduated from the Citadel in 1961 as a distinguished military graduate. And he just recently moved down to Vicenza from Heidelberg. And he's going to wind up pulling a 4-year tour, 2 in Heidelberg and 2 in Vicenza. But he doesn't mind because he spoke up, grew up speaking Italian as a kid, and his playmates all spoke Italian. And his favorite pastime in Rome, there's a streetcar that goes around the main part of town, and one goes in the opposite direction. One of them is called the circular right and the circular left. On Sunday afternoons, he used to like to go down there and hop in the damn streetcar and ride all the way around, get off, and come home. So he jabbered in Italian all the time. And the, what's the order? The Jesuits ran a school out near the Vatican for kids. And Bob Jr. went out there and he learned a heck of a lot. In fact, he skipped a grade when he came back to the States. It was an excellent school, excellent teacher. Some of them were friars, and others were laymen that had been hired. And Bob learned a heck of a lot and a heck of a lot of discipline. In fact, he went to high school in Fayetteville and graduated from there. And I was in Okinawa at the time. Fran was able to stay in quarters in Bragg until school ended. We had some idea that he might be interested in going to the University of California. He put it pretty close to Okinawa. Next thing I knew, he'd already written to the Citadel on his own. He'd been accepted. Okay, fine. His brother-in-law, that's Betsy, my youngest daughter's husband, he's also a Citadel graduate. And every now and then Kurt and Bob sort of gang up on me to say, oh, hell, we had to pay for what we went through. You got it for free. Trying to give me the works. But
Is your son married?
yeah, and he's got 2 kids of his own. Davy is now 13, and Catherine is about 12, I think.
I think this is getting close to the end now. Is there something else you'd like to tell us before we finish this?
I think you've got a lot of tape left there. It's right there, I think.
Okay.
If it was full tape, you got a lot left.
Okay.
I was going to ask, do you speak French? You said you went to Paris. Did you have to?
At one time, I was fluent in French, but not having used it.
Certainly slips away from you when you're not using it
Yeah.
around
Mhm.
people who are
Yeah.
speaking it.
And the last time I really used any Italian was in 1957. Took a group of 30 Italian officers on a tour throughout the United States. Well, as a matter of fact, I think I was the guy that originated the idea. The French were being taken around too, and one year I got dragged up from Bragg to meet the party in Washington and take them. The major general in the party, gonella, which is the Italian word for a big skirt, very nice guy, very easy to get along with. He spoke no English, but I had to scramble for the first couple of days to keep up with it, and every now and then you'd be called upon to almost do a simultaneous translation, which is miserable. But normally they would say a sentence or two and pause, and you could translate it. That's much better because oftentimes you can't come up with a precise word, so you've got to talk around it. Explain what you want
It
to say.
changes the meaning so easily. If you
Sometimes it does, yes.
Mhm.
And we went to the Pentagon, Belvoir, Benning, Bliss, Leavenworth, Granite City, Illinois, the engineer depot, then in New York City, then up to Westpoint by car and then back down again. And
What year was this that you were
that was
taking
the
to?
summer of '57. Yeah, 57. And we stopped overnight for some reason in Dallas on the way up from Bliss. And somebody there laid on a big party for the Italians. I was flaked out in the bed, sick as a dog that night, so I couldn't go. And the next day we flew up from Dallas up to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Real rough trip going up there. We were in 2 different airplanes, and one of them got hit by lightning. And we finally got to Leavenworth, and this Italian officer walked up to me and said, "Say, don't you have any damn trains in this country?"
They have such good trains in,
Oh,
in Europe.
excellent trains in Europe. But they were certainly all one night. A lot of them had distant relatives in New York, and so they sort of scattered the 4 winds. But one night in the hotel, can't remember the name, it was right across the street from what used to be the old Penn Station. which is, and I can spot 2 or 3 of them, maybe it was more than that, maybe 4 or 5 of them, in the grill. Yeety quick, come with me. Go out of the hotel, go around the corner, walk 2 blocks, go to the Empire State Building, up to the top. I think the guys that were taking the tolls down there, I think they let us go up for nothing when I explained who they were and what was going on. But when I got to the top, that was a magnificent sight up there incidentally. If you were in New York at night, go on up to the top of the Empire State Building or the New World Trade Center, either one. But it was a spectacular sight, and they were impressed. They were also impressed as we flew into LaGuardia. Off goes the safety belt and start craning up the windows, looking and saying, "Oh, came out of India! Oh!" And that, we were coming in over the Statue of Liberty, sneaking up East River up to LaGuardia. And it was an impressive sight. And but they all came together, and then we went down, took them down to McGuire to fly back to Italy, and the airplane couldn't take off for some reason, so back they came. So we had them for another day, and they all hopped on a train, I think, and went down, spent the night in Philadelphia, and came back the next day. And the next morning, put them on the airplane and saw them off. And I've got, from General Goodell, gave me steel etching, about that wide, about that high, of the ancient Foro Italico, that the ruins in the heart of Rome, the ancient city, the Temple of the Virgins, the Trajan's Gate, part of the Domus Aurea, Nero's House of Gold, part of the old Appian Way, etching the darn thing. It's a beautiful thing. Beautiful thing. You got it on the dining room wall. The guy in Austin framed it for me. Austin, Texas framed it for me. He did a beautiful job. It's got, I think it's got a red velvet mat around it.
What is it on? What type of material?
A parchment, as I recall. And he's got it fixed so that the glass is held off the paper itself with some little gadgets there, so you don't get any mashed effect. Sort of stands up there real nicely. And I forget what the devil we gave him, if anything. I had 2 other officers with me. One of them came out of the G2, and he was a linguist. He spoke Italian, French, whatever, you name it. He'd come up with it. And the other guy was of Italian origin, but the language had not been spoken in his family, I don't think. And he had a very mediocre. So this other guy and I were generally the ones that hung around with the Italians, and the other guy is the one that collected passports when we had to, or tickets and luggage and that sort of stuff, and sorted it out, and sort of a man Friday for the group. And we had 30 or 31. And on the trip out to El Paso, Bob Hope was in the airplane, and I was watching this one officer who ran out from Benny. We'd taken him to the hospital at Benny. He was complaining of stomachache. And I was watching him and sitting beside Goodell. This guy had his overcoat around him, just shivering in his face with soaked with perspiration. So I told General Goodell, I said, look at it. I said, he's sick. I want to take him to the hospital. He said, okay. So I called the stewardess and asked her if she'd have the pilot radio ahead and have an ambulance meet us. Lo and behold, they did. And we found a warrant officer there at Bliss who spoke some Italian. And lo and behold, the next day, that guy's gallbladder was out. I started checking on him that afternoon and that night. And the next day, he zipped out, and they put him on. They returned to Italy, I guess, 10 days, 2 weeks later. Put him on an airplane, sent him on back by himself.
That was a lot more difficult surgery, too, then.
Yeah, I imagine it is. But, of course, then William Beaumont was a teaching hospital. as it is now. It's General Hospital, big one. But that was quite a trip.
Is there anything you'd like to
Well,
ask?
when you mentioned his etching, I was wondering what other things you might have collected, memorable
Okay.
that you are fond
We've
of.
got in the living room 3 scenes of Rome. One of them is the Ponte de Angeli. The other is an arch in the Foro Italico. And the third one is, I can't remember. But they were an attempt by an Italian to keep his family alive. He's an architect, but yet he did these beautiful little watercolors. Not that big. And there are 3 things that are very typical of Rome. One of them is Hadrian's mausoleum, and the bridge of the angels lead to it. And this Trojan's arch in the Foro de Italico, and the, can't remember what the third one is. We've got those. And we've got 2 other watercolors of Caserta that are hanging up on the wall in the family room. And one thing we had to have in the living room that's unique, I think, it's a piece of needlework that's done in Chinese. It's framed. It's absolutely exquisite. There's a name for it. I can't remember what it is right now, but we've got that. It's long and narrow.
And you got it in China?
My mother and father got it in China.
From your mother's father?
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's a couple of other unique things in there from the Philippines. There are 2 little figures sitting like that. On their back is a bookcase. They're carved out of a wood that's just as hard as nails, and it's coal black. The Igoros up in the hills above Stotzenberg did them. And then on the wall I've got 5 bolos mounted on
What?
bolos, a knife, that were made by my father's battery mechanic in the 24th Field. And the blades are old escort wagon axles, or springs, that have been tempered and shaped and sharpened, and the handles are mahogany, and there's a wooden case for each one of them. Mahogany. So those are sticking up in the wall. And that's about, it's the only thing I got from the Philippines that I can think of. Got some Chinese rugs on the floor. It came from Peking. The way you used to work that is the person that went home from Stotzenberg a year before you did would buy the rugs for you in Peking and have them sent to you. Therefore, you could use them for a year in Stotzenberg, and when you went through customs on the way home, you could say, these are household goods, they've been in use for a year. And that's what the law requires, so you do it that way. And I went, Mother and Dad and I went to one of the rug factories there in Peking. There were 2 of them. One was called Fetty and the other was Shoemaker. And I don't know what happened to them when the communists took over. They might have gone to Taiwan or gone down to Hong Kong. I don't know. But it was a fascinating thing to see the way they make those rugs. And in those days, you paid $1 a square foot for them. A 9x12 rug would cost you $108.
Oh, goodness.
And the number of knots per square inch is indicative of the caliber and quality of the rug.
Don't they last about lifetime?
Yes, these were purchased, put on the floor in 1924.
Are they reversible?
No, they are not. They are not. The only rug that's got any damage on it is one that used to be in the living room in the house in La Jolla, California. The last few years of my life, my father's in a wheelchair. And he kept spinning the wheelchair around, and those rubber legs just created the nap off. And when you look at it, you can see the white warp sticking through. Now, if you want to, you can go through the trouble of taking some blue ink with a toothpick. And they're hidden, but the other rugs, we had them New fringe put on about 3 times. They're still about that thick. You got all told, well, the one that's so beat up is out of sight in the bedroom. We got 2 in the entry hall, 1 in the living room, 1 in the dining room, and 1 on the way into the family room. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think it's 6 of them all together.
Fortune.
Yeah. They are now. And each one of them's got a name. There's one of them that's called 99 Things, and it's just got a hodgepodge.
Chinese name, I see.
It's translated into 99 Things. There's another one, I think it's a rose. It's the dining room. But it's got these circular type things. Space blown. That's only 8 by 11. But it's got a name, and it's. I knew them once, but I certainly forgotten them because, heck, I walked away from those darn rugs in 1934 and didn't see them again until I took them out of the house in La Jolla when I moved out of there.
Who would you say is the most unforgettable character that you've had during your military career? Is there any one person who stands out?
Yep. Yeah. I can't remember his name right now. He won the Medal of Honor in World War I. Early in the war, his unit that he was eventually going to be assigned to the 10th Mountain Division was not in action. He came down to Italy from England and was acting divarty commander for a while. During that period of time, he came down and inspected the battalion and met some of the staff officers. Then he disappeared. Well over a year later, gumshoeing around the mountains of northern Italy, I was looking for a position area, a place to move to. And there was one mountain up there that overlooked the whole darn thing, and I wanted to know who owned that because the Germans owned it. I couldn't go where I wanted to because they'd shoot my tail out of there. So I barged into this Italian farmhouse, and there was this general and one of the regimental commanders sitting about like we are with a map. And I put on the brakes, saluted and said, "General, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you." He looked at me and said, "Officer, how are you?" I said, "Fine, sir. How you doing?" "Good, sir." "You doing all right?" "Fine, sir." "How's Don Grant?" "He's ES3. "How about Jim Lumen?" "He's fine, sir." "And what can I do for you?" I said, "Who owns that mountain up there?" He said, "The Germans do." "Thank you, sir. That answers my question." So I turned around and walked out. But that guy impressed me. Hayes is his name. Hayes. Yeah. You go in the Snow Hall and look at the Medal of Honor mural on the right there. There's his name. And a good friend of mine served under him, Tom Donnell, and he thinks the same way I do about Hayes. He said he's just a wonderful guy. Wonderful guy.
Wonder how he did that. Do you have any idea how?
I don't know. But
No, I think this is getting close to the end.
I checked one on the floor.
Well, it didn't even get turned on. Thank you, Colonel Offer.
You're sure
It's
welcome.
been nice visiting with you.